Good morning, everyone. My name is Bob Mahoney, and I'm stepping in for Scott Baldinelli this morning, who actually had some cyber issues with the storm that hit this part of New England. So as we're wrapping up Cyber Awareness Month, I'm sure all of you attended a number of seminars on cyber risk, and but we thought it would be interesting to talk specifically about the risks associated with at-home workers, hybrid workers, because it's such an important topic for all of us. I've got an impressive group today to help us work through these topics. Sean Croston, who's with Santander, Susie Cummings from BDO Digital, and Brian Schneider from Hub International. And these folks each have their own perspectives on these critical questions of cyber risk in a hybrid work environment. A few housekeeping matters. If you've submitted questions, we're going to do our best to get to them. If you have questions during the course of the discussion, please enter those questions into the question box. At the conclusion, we'll have an evaluation form that'll pop up on the screen. We appreciate it if you take a few minutes to look at that and give us your feedback. And lastly, just a note on today's discussion, the disclaimer, the information. I'm sorry I have to read this, but it's it's one of those things you got to do. The information herein is intended to be educational only and is based on information that is generally available. The opinions expressed represent the individuals and not Hub International, Santander Bank, or BDO Digital. The information discussed is not intended to be legal or tax advice. Consult your attorney and/or professional advisor as to your organization's specific circumstances and legal, tax, and other requirements. So we've got the legal behind us. Let's get on with the work. And I'll ask each of our wonderful panelists to just say a few words about what they do and what their organization does, and then we'll dig right into the topic. Susie, can I start with you?
Of course. Good morning, everyone. I'm Susie Cummings, and I'm the national leader of IT services for BDO Digital, which is a division of BDO USA. And the group that I work with, we primarily deal kind of with anything related to technology. So it spans from helping customers to do risk assessments and strategic planning around IT. We do the implementation of those services, and then we handle, from an ongoing perspective, additional monitoring and management testing of their environment to make sure they have the proper security as well as business enabling technologies. So very nice to meet you all. Thank you.
Thank you. And Brian Schneider from Hub.
Good morning, Brian Schneider with Hub International. And by way of background, I'm a former FBI special agent. I worked complex financial crimes in Los Angeles for several years, led theft and fraud prevention teams at a Fortune 50 retailer, and am currently working within the risk services division of Hub International. It's our full-time job to support clients with developing risk management strategies and implementing them in the realms of cyber. Obviously, today we're going to be talking about that, but theft, fraud, crisis management, business continuity as well. And I'm very pleased to be here. Thank you very much.
Well, I'm sure you'll have some good war stories for us, Brian. I'm looking forward to that. And Sean Croston from Santander.
Hi, good morning, everyone. I'm Sean Croston. I'm the Chief Information Security Officer for Santander in the United States. There's 4 separate financial services companies in Santander in the U.S., and inclusive of Santander Bank North America. Prior to joining Santander, I was a supervising examiner for the Federal Reserve Bank. I was the bank's worst enemy, so to speak, because I was the one going in, making sure they were doing all the things they should be doing from a security standpoint. And prior to that, I had a number of years in global financial institutions and in security. And again, thank you very much for having me today.
Right. Well, I think we have the benefit of a lot of years of experience and several different points of view on this subject. But I'm going to start with Sean to just try to lay out some of the groundwork. Obviously, there were plenty of cyber risks around prior to the pandemic, but now with the advent of at-home work and hybrid work and people bringing the corporate jewels home every night in their car, there's a whole bunch of new risks. And so maybe you can sort of give us a sense for what are the biggest challenges, the broadest challenges associated with remote workers. Sean?
Yeah, and I'll invite my fellow panelists as well to jump in as they see fit too. You know, the first thing is have a plan, right? So you have remote workers. Do you know who those remote workers are? Do you know how they're accessing your systems? Do you know and understand the type of technologies that they're using to access those systems? So basically get a landscape and understanding of your employees' access. And then from there, is it the right type of access? Do you have the right types of controls? But overall, do you have a framework to understand those risks? So I'll give you an example. One of the things that prior to the pandemic, remote printing or employees printing documents at home was not allowed, basically at Santander. That really isn't something we could do in the middle of the pandemic where people couldn't come into the office. So we had to enable that for business reasons, but we had to create a framework to identify who needed to print remotely. What are the rules around that? Is there a governance process? And then who signs off on it? And what are the conditions on signing off on that? So that's an example of the world changed. And our risk identification, quantification, and approval process had to change with it. So those are the types of things when I say have a plan is have you identified what's changed in your environment? Can you quantify it, and then you can do the appropriate thing as far as a risk management standpoint.
Susie, what are some of the new risks that you see as a result of remote workers?
Sure, and I think what we have right now, which is I think challenging a lot of organizations, is a hybrid approach where they've got some remote workers, some people, bringing their devices into their, corporate environment, and so we've got this situation where, we still have clients who, frankly, are letting their employees access their networks from personal devices, and so I think, if you think about the remote access and to Sean's point about, how you get in. Many people might not have a VPN enabled situation at home where they've got the same controls that they would have in a corporate environment, or they're working on a personal device that's a family device and you don't know necessarily whether it's properly patched and updated. So there's just some things I think that to the point earlier that there's kind of maybe a lack of control of really understanding who's accessing the network, on what devices they're accessing it, how secure those devices are. And then ultimately, we also saw some clients who, just in the interest of keeping their businesses going, kind of let their employees take data out of the corporate environment. And, you lose, kind of control over that very important data. It could be protected data. It could be other data that's important to the organization. So I think just, kind of looking at things holistically, and I often equate it to, your personal life, right? So we have locks on our doors. We don't, keep our valuables out. We keep them secure. We know how to safeguard them. We don't let strangers, into our house. So there's just things, I think, if you kind of take a common sense approach to it and really inventory what you have, and then try to protect it as best as possible, and train your people to know what they, what they're doing and how to protect it, I think are, a couple of key points to make.
Well, Susie, I think you touched on an interesting one, which is the human element. And as we worked from home or we start working remotely, we've isolated the employee physically as well. And so, when you think about some of the threat vectors, the methods that are being used to scam employees or gain illicit access, IT department is no longer down the hallway. There aren't necessarily the people right there who can help you understand. And so really controlling the human element, helping employees to understand what to be aware of has become really one of the biggest challenges, in my opinion.
Yeah, I would agree. And I think it's, ever evolving. We're seeing the sophistication of, these ransomware and phishing campaigns, really accelerate. And, they're posing as CEOs of companies. And, if you're not training and then doing ongoing testing with your employees, you run a huge risk. I think 95% of cyber attacks are, attacks are due to human error.
I think, what was I going to say? We've also paused really important controls. So in the name of getting things done in a difficult remote or hybrid environment, we've paused like very important controls that we did have in place in the office. I was working with a smaller client the other day who felt it was just more efficient and easier to have Phil access both the bank account and the statements, and so yeah, it's easier, but also you've potentially created a major risk, by pausing on those important procedural controls too.
Yeah, I agree, Brian. Like, again, I'll come back to what's the plan, right? So does your firm have a plan? Do they identify those types of scenarios? So do you give guidance that, one of the interesting things is working from home is not everybody's home's the same. So people don't have appropriate workspace. Can you identify appropriate workspace? Do you recognize that, yeah, it's your roommate, but he really shouldn't be looking over your shoulder at financial information or confidential information? That type of education and awareness, and giving people that sort of those guidelines, and say, hey, this is what you should and shouldn't do when you're working from home versus being in the office. That's really important. And then identifying those, again, I would say those must-have situations like printing, and there are other situations, in saying, hey, if we're going to allow this, let's make sure from a risk standpoint we know it and we can identify it. And then we all, as executives and adults, understand we're going to accept that risk or not. And then that way, one of the interesting things is oftentimes people of great influence in companies have great influence over IT and InfoSec people. I'm the senior person, I'm gonna do this, and you better do it or not. And if there's not a framework or some guidance that says, I really don't care who you are, because the CEO told me, here are the rules. And if you want to have that exception, you've got to go through this process and to get that exception. And those are the types of things, because oftentimes, it's being done for, I'd probably say, the good business reason, but it's not good for the InfoSec reason or the IT control reason. And making sure that sort of thought through a little bit puts folks like us in a spot where we can defend the policy, right? And we can defend the guidelines. But again, it comes back to me having a plan. And Susie, you touched on some really important things, like, do you know who's accessing your network and what are they accessing it on? Did you tell your employees, if you are going to access from home, we need to have evidence that you have full anti-malware, Windows Defender, it's up to date, if you allow that. If you're going to use a VPN, does it have multi-factor authentication? Well, we're not going to let you in unless it's this VPN type with multi-factor authentication. Because a lot of people that they had struggled with, well, what do I do? I've got to get my work done. I'm just going to go do something because I have to get my work done. And that's sort of the priority over security. Now, I think we've transitioned, thankfully, over a period of time where much of this has been thought through. But if it's not, I'd encourage everybody who's listening to go back, review your plan, understand where your risks are.
And I think too, just understanding that there are tools that you can use to help monitor, and manage what access is being given. And I think one of the things that we've seen probably over the last maybe 4 or 5 months, where we've seen a higher level of turnover with our clients, is that, they might offboard somebody, but they might not offboard them in a way, when they terminate them or they leave, to ensure that they've got the proper controls in place of what access did they have. Did they possibly maybe have a back door that you're not aware of? We also have this with clients, because we work on a lot of client projects where we have to go through a pretty elaborate onboarding to notify the client that this individual is no longer with the firm, and we're revoking their access, and you should too. So I think it's that downstream kind of holistic approach that is really critical. And I just want to mention one other thing to your point about maybe like least privileged access or having layers of independence as it relates to, what are the gates that certain, individuals can, go through that has oversight on it. So I think we were talking the other day about a client of mine who their CFO was in the hospital with his wife. He was really stressed out. He got a phishing campaign. He was looking at it, a phishing email through his email on his mobile phone. It was a kind of a weird thing that the president of the company would be asking him to make a purchase. But he just said yes because he didn't have the full picture. He didn't, he wasn't able to look on his phone and see that, boy, this email doesn't seem right, or the language in which this individual is using doesn't really sound like the president, but I'm going to hit yes. And it was actually $24,999, right under their cap for a wire transfer. And he executed it, and it created this very involved, very concerning, cascading impact to their organization. And they spent a lot of money trying to remediate that and close the gaps and understand what access that individual got when they got in that way.
When I hear all this, I wonder about the risk of rogue employees, given the new vulnerabilities that companies have with at-home workers. Are there cases where bad guys actually join a company just to get access to the information and then take advantage of it? Is that happening?
Well, I think that is happening, and I, as a former fraud guy, I'm also interested in why that's happening. And I think that, the pandemic, but also the subsequent remote work environment has created the motivation or the incentive to do so. I mean, anyone who knows fraud knows that it happens, when three things align, it's the old fraud triangle, the Cressy model, but, you've got motivation, an incentive, you've got the opportunity to do something, and then you also have a rationalization around doing that thing. And so, we've been talking about technical controls, which is opportunity, right? So if your cyber controls, if your security controls are buttoned up, you may be reducing the opportunity that somebody has to make a bad decision. But what I think is really interesting is the motivation or the incentive or the pressure to do something. We're living in a time where many have been laid off and are perhaps disgruntled that they had to go home in the first place, or now today are perhaps upset that they have to go back to the office, or that they have to be vaccinated, or insert any number of stressors today. It's just created an environment where I think the motivation, the pressure, the incentive to perhaps do something is greater. And then when you have opportunity, whether you're in a world without really good controls, and you have pressure, then it's easier to rationalize what you're doing. I did it because I had to care of my family, or I had to, they owe it to me for doing what they did. So, we're all human, and that can happen inside of all of us. And so as risk managers, as folks trying to control that, I think that's an interesting aspect to think about in the remote world.
Well, it also says in the recruiting process and the hiring process, in spite of the tight labor market, which causes you to try to move fast, it's worth making that extra phone call to the last employer just to make sure you understand exactly why that person's not there anymore. Sean, I'm interested.
Background checks, those types of things, are critical. I mean, I know we are, we're growing like crazy. And so, we've had people say, we should just move more quickly, like wait until we can get them started and we can deal with the background check later. And absolutely not. Like you have to maintain that control and really determine who you're letting into your house for the most part.
I'm interested in the secondary risks around vendors and customers, because the people you're selling to and the people you're buying from also have remote workers, also have these new risks. How does one think about the risks associated with customers who have some of your information, or particularly vendors who have your information. They might have bank account numbers, as an example.
Well, I think that's an excellent question, and as a former Target Corporation employee, that one hits a little close to home. And Susie, I know you know about this one too, but way back in 2013, we had that precedent-setting breach at Target, and many may not know that they were breached because an HVAC contractor was compromised themselves. Their credentials were compromised, and so the threat actors used those compromised credentials to get access to the company network, and then were able to get in and do a whole bunch of different things. But the questions that we're asking ourselves, when we're thinking about cyber hygiene for our own organization, are the very same questions we should be asking our third parties before we get into a relationship with them. Have you trained your people? Have you audited your own network systems? Have you reviewed, the third party contracts, within that third party, asking them about how they're securing and backing up the data that may belong to you. I think also, asking whether they have cyber insurance coverage is a great question too, or what their, incident response plan is like. I think these are all now fair and common questions that should be asked related to a third party.
Yeah, I agree, Brian. As a financial institution, we have an entire third-party risk management and assessment function. So if we're procuring services, they're all risk rated appropriately, and then depending on that risk, it's a very, very detailed risk assessment from an IT and information security standpoint. So not only do we ask the questions, we require our third parties to provide evidence. For instance, a SOC 2 report that states they've been audited and their control processes are there. And we'll ask them for their exceptions. We'll also ask them for their patching levels. Right? Where are you in your patching? It goes back to your point, Brian, about hygiene, right? And some of the things that are most important from an information security standpoint is, it sounds, I don't want to oversimplify, but it really is true, is do you know where all your assets are? Do you know your servers, who has laptops, if you issued mobile devices? Do you know if they're all patched up appropriately? And do you know if they're being monitored? And if they're being monitored, what are you seeing when they're being monitored? So we ask those questions, obviously, of ourselves, and as a core part of the information security program. But we also ask that of our third parties in order to get a view of, is this someone we should be doing business with or not? But it's a lot of work. It's hard, and depending on what size of the company you have and the resources you have, you certainly need a plan to do it. And then I think what you need to do is sort of risk rate those vendors based on what kind of information you're sharing with them, and just get real comfort that it's a secure environment, or as secure as it can be. And to your point about insurance, I think that's very interesting as well, Brian. I think that's a very good observation.
Yeah, we had so I think it's as much as what data do they have, or what access do they have to your data, but also I think on the other side, like what services are they providing and what dependencies you have on them. We had a client for whom they had a partner that had a private data center, and they housed their ERP application. And it was an industry kind of focused ERP, so they had a lot of customers. Well, they fell victim to a phishing campaign, and then that kind of turned into some access. They ended up getting into a ransomware situation, and so their entire network, their entire database of clients and the application was basically inaccessible. So they literally rendered, I don't know, I think 150 companies just helpless in terms of managing and working in their business. And then there was this whole litany of things that occurred because they did not want to pay the ransom and they didn't really have the resources internally to understand what access they had and how they could mitigate the situation. They didn't have cyber insurance, so there was a lot of not only impact to them as an organization, I don't even know if they're in business anymore, but the impact to those 150 companies was debilitating. They don't, we rely on technology. We think about, what happened earlier today, with the storm, and you don't have internet access anymore. Well, imagine if you don't have any way to pay your vendors, to pay your employees, to have people record time, to, all those things are really at the mercy of really the internet, anymore. So there's a lot of things that come into play there for sure.
Susie, what was the root cause of that problem that the company had? What was the starting point?
Lack of controls on, I think it was initially maybe an employee situation where someone clicked on a phishing email, they got access, and then they took control of the network, and then basically, literally, just a screen popped up and they were shut out. They were shut out. Their customers were shut out. They couldn't access without paying the ransom.
And, Susie, I don't know the particulars, obviously, of that situation, but one of the things that there's a lot of marketing of go to the cloud. We're in the cloud. Everything's in the cloud, and we're so much more secure in the cloud, and we're smarter than you. We're better than you because we're in the cloud. And it's like, it feels good, right? It's like, oh, great, these guys are better than us, and we should go everything into the cloud or in their model. Just, it's like that warm blanket feeling. Don't believe it. Most of it's marketing. You still got to do your due diligence. You still have to understand that they have the right hygiene, the right control model, and can they prove it, right? That's the other thing is like, show me something that you've been audited and a third party or someone has said, we're comfortable with this. Even if you're a small company, those are fair requests, right? This isn't something where, well, we're a big service provider. How dare you ask us that? It's like, well, if they say that to you, they're not the right service provider for you.
Definitely.
Sean, say a little bit about the banking side, in particular, the incidence of real money going out the door to bad guys. Is that happening?
It happens. It happens. I'm going to speak generally now, right? I'm not speaking specifically on behalf of Santander, but there's what I would say as an overarching comment is most of the money that's going out the door is because of fraud. So, and there's a convergence between cyber and fraud, clearly, right? So, if you think about big data breaches, and we've all read about them, I won't name them specifically, but there's a big data breach in which username passwords have been stolen. They're published on areas of the dark web, and they're purchased by bad actors. So what bad actors do will say, hey, I've got Susie's username password for LinkedIn, for instance, right? Let's go try this at ABC Bank. Maybe she used the same username password, so I'm going to try to log in as her at ABC Bank. And if they get a hit, then now they're in, right? And then that's where we see a lot of, I'd say as an industry is where we see a lot of the money being moved out. I don't see it so much as someone hacked in and basically compromised the payment system. The other area where we see money being moved, and it was brought up earlier, is business executive compromise emails, right? So the case that Susie gave exactly is someone spoofed an email and it said, hey, I'm the CEO, move this money, do it now, and someone approves that money flow. Those are the primary areas where we see money move now. There's insider too. Let's just be really clear. There's insider threats that happen in banks where certain interestingly enough, where we see it from a customer standpoint, and Brian, this is probably an area, it sounds like your expertise is, there are people that are put in compromised situations. Either they need money for really something's going wrong in their home, they need to pay for surgery or their mortgage, or they're being extorted where someone has something on them, right? They have compromising information or they're being threatened, in which employees of banks are doing things that they shouldn't be doing to move money, as well as we see customers on the wholesale banking side, where their employees are being compromised as well, and they're using bank platforms to move money as well. So that's really, Bob, where I see the money being moved.
So the bank systems are holding up. It's just people are getting access to the information they shouldn't have.
Yeah, and again, I'm generalizing, right? I'm speaking at a general level, but that's where I see really the money being moved. Yeah.
And you know, the other place that money is going is as we talked about the ransom and the money being extorted in that fashion. I can share, we've seen, I mean, just maybe this is common knowledge now, but just drastic increases in the ransom demands over the last 5 years. This year we've seen demands cross the $50 million mark with payouts, ranging easily from 2 million to 40 million, depending on the incident. And so I think at last glance, the global average cost of a breach, and that includes a ransomware event, was almost $4 million. I think it was even higher in the United States. So it's interesting to think about, the cost of a breach as well in terms of, money going places. Have you thought about how, as a business leader, have you thought about what it would take to respond to an incident like that? And when we say the cost of a breach, yes, of course, we're talking about the ransom that's demanded, but there are other costs as well, to detect it and to escalate it, to engage, the right breach response vendors, whether it's a privacy attorney or a breach coach or a forensic investigations firm to help you come in and understand what's going on, document evidence, the post-breach response costs related to communicating with affected parties and,
regulatory, depending what industry you're in, right? If it's outside the financial, so there's still regulatory concerns. There's fines, like you said, Brian, there's lots of post-boom costs outside of paying that ransom. I do want to circle back, Bob, just a little bit on, I mentioned the account takeover and a data breach. This goes back to remote workers as well. Change your passwords. Don't have the same password for access to your corporation as you do to your LinkedIn.
Guilty as charged. Guilty.
Yeah, exactly. And and by the way, make sure you have different passwords and then change those passwords. So for instance, there's policies, most institutions, certainly in the financial industry, where you're forced password changes, right? I've got one popping up on me right now saying, Sean, you got to change your password for work. But change your passwords and don't have the same password for, the various sites that you would go to. That's something from a remote worker standpoint we put a lot of re-emphasis on. Because it's very easy to be like, hey, I'm on my personal, at Santander, no one can access the network unless you have a Santander asset. So we don't let anybody access even contractors, right? Because I'm not comfortable as the CISO that remote worker or that remote, just contractor, I'm not confident their systems actually have the appropriate level of protections. So you have to come in a Santander asset. You have to come over a VPN with multi-factor. I can monitor everything that's happening on your asset. So we really, really lock it down. But for shops that don't, you might be multi-purposing passwords, and it could be your password to get into your work environment as well. So make sure you're changing those, you have unique passwords and you're changing them often.
So that's a good question for leaders to ask their HR people or their chief information officer. What's our password process? What's our password policy? What are we telling our colleagues to do about passwords? Well, Susie, we talked about incidents a little bit, and I'm curious about incident response plans. What does that mean to have an incident response plan?
Well, I can certainly add some input to this, but I think Brian probably has some insights as well. So I think we have a full network operations center and a security operations center. So we're on the front ends of some of these situations where someone will report something, or we'll notice something, some odd behavior, some brute force access, trying to get into the environment. and we'll kind of shut things down. Or sometimes if a user's already been compromised, then it's a matter of really engaging what we call a severity 1 incident, where we've got a protocol that we work on, and it's a very deliberate plan that we work out with our customers in terms of what's going to happen in what sequence, who needs to be notified, what escalation paths do we need. And when we have these security events, typically we're asking the customer right out of the gate, or knowing already, do you have cyber insurance? And when that happens, there's kind of a conversation that needs to take place, because you can do some damage if you start poking around and you're trying to figure out what's going on. You can actually limit the ability to kind of see what's happening, and forensically look at what access people had and when, and those types of things. So an incident plan really is an important way to kind of start the triage and the remediation resolution process. So I think that's Brian's business, so I'll let him comment on that as well.
Yeah, I think the question for our audience is, do you know the difference between the various plans and which ones you're potentially in the market for? I think that's an area where I've seen some clarity goes a long way. The difference between like an IT disaster recovery plan and an incident response plan. And one's a very technical plan that's going to help your IT department, a set of instructions for reconfiguring and very detailed infrastructure. That critical incident response plan, as you said, Susie, is more like a playbook for the team that's going to be leading through this disruptive event on that fateful day. And it does speak to important pieces like, who are we going to engage first? What are we going to do to validate this? What are the steps to escalate it? But there are important aspects to clarify and do in the right order. I mean, think about legal privilege, for example. When you start to engage other vendors and start talking about an incident after it's happening, what are you saying? So engaging a privacy attorney right away might be something that's a priority for you, and that's something that would go into your incident response plan. That would be supported with an incident response policy that helps to drive, compliance with the plan that you're putting in place. I think, you've mentioned insurance too. It's interesting because securing cyber insurance coverage is not what it used to be, and carriers are asking for copies of those plans, for example. So in order to renew or bind coverage, they might ask you, could we see your incident response plan and take a look at it? And some of our clients are saying, well, I don't have one, and that's a hard place to be today.
Brian, if I'm a $50 million wholesaler, is my incident response plan 50 pages, 2 pages? What is it? How big a job is it creating one of these things?
Well, that's a great question, and it can range. And I think at the very minimum, a breach response protocol could be as simple as a 1 or 2 page document that basically aligns leaders on the day of. For an organization that size, maybe it's just about helping people understand that we need to call the carrier to engage breach response vendors, because we have coverage and we have access to resources that are going to help us today. Or conversely, we don't have coverage. We don't have any prearranged response or retained response vendors in place. And so here are the steps that your IT team is going to be doing, or your third-party provider is going to be helping you. So it could be as simple as a 10-step list of things that you need to be thinking about and doing in the right order on day of disruption. It could also be very in-depth, depending on your organization and how it's structured, the different various sub-entities, how you're going to be validating that incident might require an in-depth plan as well. So it definitely ranges, or could range. But I think at the very least, understanding who you're going to engage that day and what steps you're going to take in what order is the basics of a cyber incident response plan. If you think about if you're a manufacturer and you have a warehouse or a facility, you have those OSHA-driven site-level emergency action plans, and those are about ensuring that people and property are protected. Those are evacuation plans or shelter-in-place plans, right? I would say that the IT or cyber version of that is an IT disaster recovery plan, and here's the playbook, the instructions for all of the stuff we have laid out here, and here are the technical instructions for rebooting those systems, getting things back up and running. If you think about a crisis management plan on that front, you're thinking about who's going to assemble, what's the team in our organization that's going to assemble to communicate and to to manage this crisis in the minutes to hours after an event. That's the equivalent of that in the IT space is the cyber incident response plan. And then of course you get into business continuity, which is as you are into the days to weeks after a disruptive event, you're thinking about the operations within your organization that have been impacted, whether it was a loss of facility or whether it was loss of important technology, perhaps it was loss of personnel or something within the supply chain, an important supplier. And so those plans, which I call business continuity or operational continuity plans, are there to help guide through those days and weeks as you recover from a critical incident.
Yeah, I think I would just pick up on what Brian's saying is that in the example Susie gave, that so if you identify your critical systems that you absolutely cannot run your business on, and yes, if you have an attack, what's your resiliency plan? So what's your backup? What's my alternative, right? So can I quickly go to another vendor? Do I do manual processes? What's the plan, assuming this platform is ransomware or it's out of commission, which is a little bit different because we're not talking about recovery, where recovery could be weeks, if ever, depending on the event. But those are some of the things that I see a lot of our customers, typically customers that are maybe a little bit more bigger than the smaller customers, that they've thought through what resiliency looks like. They've thought through what their options would be, and they could basically have a confidence that they could resume business within the appropriate period of time commensurate with the function that they're looking at. So in the banking world, if we can't make payments, that's lifeblood for us. So we have full resiliency plans that if we can't make payments, what do we do? What's the alternative? And those types of plans are in place for us, and we test them as an example.
Yeah, I think what we see sometimes with our customers as well is they might develop a plan like that, and then their environment changes and they don't have the proper processes in place to make sure that that documentation and the execution of that plan is current. So we've inherited some environments through our managed services practice. We're like, well, give us your disaster recovery plan, and it's from systems that are probably no longer in the environment, or they're relying on somebody else to execute a certain part of their delivery from a technology standpoint. So I think as we've kind of gone through this process and talking about it, reflecting on really some diligence around maintaining documentation, understanding who's going to execute the plan. We've had plans that we've inherited where Jimmy, who's no longer with the company, is the person that's leading the charge. And so you really need to kind of keep current and almost think about that in terms of I guess maintaining a checkbook. You're going to have your money coming in, you're going to have your money going out. You got to keep track of that, who's got access to that money, and how are you going to write checks, or how are you going to get money going if for some reason one of those systems is not available. So I think just the attention that needs to be paid to IT anymore, and the controls around it, I think are oftentimes not taken as seriously as they should be.
Talk about the decision that a business leader must make in terms of building this intelligence internally, this capability to do incident plans and check on systems and check on all the different devices and passwords, doing that internally as opposed to hiring a third party to to be sort of their arms and legs on this. And how do you make that decision? How do you think about that decision?
I could certainly comment on this, and then others can chime in. I don't want to be self-promotion here, doing any self-promotion, but at the same time, I think IT resources are scarce, and to effectively run, I think, an IT department, you need fractions of different types of expertise. And so I think, maybe dividing and conquering, does it make sense for you to try to hire, a 24/7 network operations center who can monitor and manage your environment? Maybe, maybe not, right? So I think really evaluating what you think you need, or getting some consultation on what best practices are, what is the framework of different services and expertise that you need, and then determine, do I have that internally? Do I want to pay to have a full-time person do that, or do I want to have an agreement with somebody else that maybe handles part of it, and we work in collaboration together, getting the 24/7 coverage you need and the expertise, while also having an internal team that's really maybe focused on business enablement or the application side of things. So it really is, I think, dependent on how large the company is and how complicated things are, in the environment. But I think it's critical, at the C level and maybe at the board level, to be really honest with yourselves about what you have and what you need, and try to, close those gaps as quickly as possible.
I think one thing too that became clear for us in the wake of some of these precedent-setting breaches was that compromises and these aren't just an IT issue, as you said, Susie. Like, these are core to these incidents, and their impacts are becoming core to an enterprise's strategy. I mean, I remember at Target, way back in 2013, in the wake of that, as we were all hearing about free credit monitoring for the first time, and we were, talking about privacy and credit card information in the background, they were having a real continuity crisis. I mean, it was no coincidence that they backed out of Canada. They were pursuing expansion into Canada, and they had to halt that strategy. CIO, CFO were terminated. Hundreds of employees were laid off. Those were all ill effects of that breach, and so it became very clear for that organization and others around that this concept of enterprise security risk management, these decisions, these assessments, this evaluation of our exposure as we consider enterprise level strategies, it has to be integrated, right? So that it's no longer that security is a cost of doing business, it's that security is at the table, when strategic initiatives like working from home or like pushing into that new market or developing this new branch is at the table, part of the decision. And yeah.
And I would just add one more thing. I think what we're seeing a lot from customers as well is having independence there, right? If you are just sitting around the table and you are trying to figure out what the strategy is, and you have all the same people, that maybe don't have or aren't informed potentially about what they should be looking at, you may get into a situation where you're just thinking you're protected or thinking you have the proper controls in place, but it's limited to what the knowledge is in that room, as opposed to getting somebody independent coming in and saying, we have experience in your industry. Here's what your peers are doing. Here's what the folks are doing that are larger than you, and kind of setting out a plan that might help to bring them along. And then I think that kind of ever present evaluation, because things are changing every minute, every day, that to kind of have that be an ongoing conversation and a real honest look at how things are going is an important thing, at least maybe on a minimum of a quarterly basis or something.
And do you think these third parties are smart about the remote worker risk?
I think it depends on the third party. Clearly, yeah. So, I like the conversation prior is that, I'll oversimplify, but if you don't think you have a problem, you don't have a problem. And a lot of what we hear is, the maturity of the executive management team, understanding that cyber risk is the same as liquidity risk or supply chain risk or any other type of risk. It's no longer put off as an IT function, IT problem, and that's where the mindset needs to be. Some folks aren't there yet. Some folks are, and I think where you see the exploits happening in the industry across all industries are the executive management teams that don't look at cybersecurity as a primary risk. It should be one of your top 5 risks. And I don't care what business you're in, because you're susceptible. And so I think that's probably the primary thing. As far as third parties, excuse me, you've got to do your due diligence on the third party. You've got to check up on those third parties, make sure they have appropriate references and they're fit for purpose for you. And that's a lot of what I see is you have to really define what you want that third party to do. So just tell me where my problems are. Don't try to upsell me on 5 different things. I just want to know where my problems are. If that's what you want, define it that way, right? And then if you get that type of assessment, then you can go back into the market and say, who do I use to help me fix some of these problems? So you have to look at it, in my view, you have to look at it from what am I trying to accomplish? Make it very crisp. Do your RFP, RFI, whatever it is, get your feedback, check up on the vendors, and then get that assessment if you can afford to do it. That's probably the best way to do it. Self-assessments are really, really important. At Santander, we've got a team of over 230 people doing information security in the US alone, never mind globally. And we do self-assessments. I still have an independent third party come in and do an assessment on Santander. It's not that I don't trust my people, not that I don't trust our disciplines, our control model, but I bring them in because it's the right thing to do. Now, we can afford to do that, but really the point I'm trying to illustrate is you make sure that you have another view in if you can afford it, because it's really important.
So Brian, in the few minutes we have left, and others as well, I want to hear about insurance, because when all else fails, there's always insurance, right? So what are the 2 or 3 questions that the leader of a company should be thinking about when it comes to cyber insurance?
Yeah, great question. I mean, the theory here is transfer as much of this risk as you can via insurance. And then what we've been talking about up till now is how you manage the risk that you ultimately retain and are unable to transfer. But the interesting part about the cyber insurance market is that this increased threat we're talking about has caused massive losses for insurance companies. The claims frequency and severity is extremely high, in part because of some of the DIY approaches that insureds are taking with incident response. They have very few levers to pull, though, to remedy this. So, we're seeing increased premiums. Depending on the factors, you could expect anywhere from 30 to 400% increases in your cyber insurance premiums, which is outrageous. But they're also limiting capacity and restricting different coverages. So I think the takeaway for business leaders around this increased underwriting scrutiny and is to really just understand that they're looking for best-in-class organizations, and they're going to make you fill out a scrolling application that asks about all the controls that we've talked about today. They want to know about your cyber awareness efforts with employees. They want to see your incident response plan. 10 months ago, nobody knew what MFA stood for and weren't asking for that. 2 months ago, you can't bind coverage without multi-factor implemented on all corners of your infrastructure. And as of a couple months ago, or a couple of weeks ago, I've seen carrier questionnaires that ask that it have been implemented and on for 3 months. So my point is, the scrutiny is increasing, and so the questions I think to ask yourself are, do you have a firm grasp around your own risk profile? Do you know where you may have gaps? Have you given yourself enough time to get ready for a renewal or a placement of coverage if you're interested? And yeah, do you know how your cyber hygiene stacks up against others? Because those are going to be critical moments in your pursuit of insurance.
Other thoughts on insurance, Susie, Sean?
It's a tricky evolving, as Brian illustrated, it's a tricky and an evolving sort of market segment. And I think, if I'm not mistaken, the French government said to AXA Financial, which is an insurance provider, that you can't pay out anymore. So, that's an interesting dynamic global in the insurance industry. And, it's going to mature, and, I just keep your eyes on it, engage now if you can, and you're gonna have to model that out and see if it's within your risk appetite.
Yeah, and I think ultimately, that you make sure you're getting what you think you're getting. I mean, we've had customers who are like, I thought I had this level of coverage, I don't have it. So they still have, in addition to their premiums, they might get, some restitution, but it's not what they thought it was, or it wasn't as complete as they thought it was.
Yeah, I think the message too is they're no longer these cyber policies are no longer all-inclusive packages. They really are pieced together, and this is where you should leverage your trusted advisors to help you piece together kind of a menu, a collection of coverages that will get you what you're after. I think a couple things that came to mind related to claims issues that we've seen. Many insurance carriers have now a predetermined list of response vendors that you need to leverage. They're available to you, but you have to leverage those. If, for example, you go outside and engage response vendors outside of those that you're supposed to be using, it can lead to claims issues down the line. I think another interesting one, as a former FBI, the OFAC list, the Office of Treasury, has created a sanction list, if you're not aware of it. This is basically a list of entities globally that are national security interests. And so you could be put into the position of having insurance, having ransom coverage, and then you find out that the threat actor is on the OFAC sanction list. And if you pay them, you'll face a mighty federal penalty. Or maybe in the future just be prohibited from paying them at all. So that's just another terrible but interesting aspect to breach response that we're seeing as well.
Well, cyber risk was certainly with us before the pandemic, and the incidence of hybrid and remote working is only going to continue from what I can see. So it's the new challenges are for real, and I appreciate your thoughts on all this, and I hope our audience has gotten some good tips out of it. I'm sure they have. Any final words on how people should think about the new risks associated with remote workers?
I was just going to mention, I think the companies, the businesses need to, take control, and the downstream impact might be a little bit inconvenient for your employees, multi-factor authentication or changing your password or not being able to use, your personal device. But I think, a lot of risks can be mitigated by just implementing some very basic, controls and security measures.
Mm-hmm. I just have to ask you a very trivial question. Are there devices that are just fundamentally less secure?
Obsolete ones that can't be patched.
Okay.
That's sorry. That's don't use anything that can't be patched. That's obsolete.
Okay.
Probably the best answer, Bob, for me.
Got it. And are there environments? I mean, if I'm doing the work of my company, in the backyard versus the office versus the car, or should I be more concerned about different environments, or is that not an issue?
For us, it's an issue. Again, I spoke about like your workspace at home, making sure that you have space, you recognize who's around you, not around you, so it's information access. But clearly, if you're at a Starbucks and you get up to go, to say hi to a friend, you leave your laptop there, it could be gone in 5 seconds. You'll never know, right? You'll never see it. So those are the types of things I would recommend staying away from.
Good. Well, again, thank you all. This has been terrific. I really appreciate your time this morning. And if the audience has questions, please post them in the question box, and we'll try to get back to you as soon as possible. So with that, thank you all. Appreciate your time.
Thank you for the opportunity. Bye-bye.
Thank you.